a challenge to dignity. Our goal was to link academics, activists, and agencies concerned with the health of refugees and asylum seekers in a spirit of collaboration and comparison, bringing together professionals working with different populations of forcibly displaced peoples, ethnic groups, and nations. The video you are watching will contain an individual presentation edited to stand alone. We hope you find them to be of value.
Okay, so now I would like to introduce our next set of speakers. They are Christian Assefa, who is a PhD student in the Ethnic Studies Department at UC San Diego, and Andrew Blank, who is an MPH and intern at the UC San Diego Refugee Health Unit in San Diego, California. And the title of their talk today is Refugee Collaboration and Self-Determination in San Diego. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having us, for giving us this opportunity to share with you today. My name is Andrew Blank. I earned my Master of Public Health from the University of Southern California. And while I was there, I supported the UC San Diego Refugee Health Unit in building and leading the San Diego Refugee Communities Coalition through COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm joined by Christian Assefa, a PhD student in the Ethnic Studies Department at UC San Diego. And through a grant from the Critical Refugee Studies Collective, Christian participated in a community-based participatory approach ethnographic project with the SDRCC that included 12 oral histories with the organizational members of our coalition. So we're honored to be able to share this story with you today. And next slide, please. So today our objectives in the first half, I'll talk a little bit about just the SDRCC as a concept, how it was formed, who comprises it, and just a couple of projects to give you a little bit of insight into how this program is implemented. And then I'll turn it over to Christian, who will share a lot of her research about the model of our coalition and a lot of the ideas that our coalition is built upon and why it has proved to be successful over the past couple of years. So San Diego is home to about 40% of refugees who have come into California in the last couple of decades, including 23,000 refugees resettled since 2009. And so in response to that, there are a number of ethnic community-based organizations that serve specific refugee communities inside San Diego. And so in 2019, we formed a coalition of about 11 or 12 of those ethnic community-based organizations in order to collectively support refugee communities and to make sure that they are healthy, safe, and thriving. So that's the mission of the SDRCC. We lead a coordinated approach to collectively reduce health and socioeconomic disparities among all those diverse refugee communities that we serve in San Diego. And like a number of other people have shared today, that includes refugees from a number of different locations all around the world, including the Middle East, North and East Africa, and all over Asia and Central and South America. Next slide, please. So one of the projects that we worked on as soon as COVID kind of started and made an impact in San Diego was a community impact report. And so we were able to collectively use the different relationships that we had through our ethnic community-based organizations and the networks that we formed, the trust that we had with our community, in order to conduct a pretty comprehensive survey of how the pandemic was specifically impacting refugee communities in San Diego. And so that assessment covered over 300 families in 12 languages. Those families came from 18 different countries. It included both kind of a traditional survey and focus group sessions. Interviews were conducted both over the phone and in person. And we covered a wide range of topics, including the social determinants of health and equity and how COVID-19 was impacting different parts of people's lives. And what this really did for us was we were able to look at ideas like health, employment, housing, education, social networks, and come up with data about how the pandemic was impacting refugees. And we could take that data and go directly to the county or the city or the state and advocate for specific policies. So we could say, hey, we just learned that 30% of San Diego's refugees were not able to make their rent payment due to COVID-19's impact on employment. So we, based on that data, are advocating that we extend an eviction moratorium, or we could argue for more support in terms of mental health or in terms of technological training to help parents who are trying to help their children at home with some of the technical requirements needed for distance education. So this impact was pretty instrumental in us being able to advocate locally, and it was picked up, gave us a lot of good media coverage in order to generate interest and support from throughout the community to advocate for refugees. And then another major project that is still ongoing today and has been going for the last 2 years or so is the COVID-19 Communication and Health Outreach Initiative. So this was funding that we were able to get through the county to use the community health worker model, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The community health worker model is especially appropriate for communities that are maybe harder to reach for a number of different reasons. In our case, there's a history of systemic racism in this country. There's legitimate concerns about vaccines or about health and medical experimentation among Black and Brown communities. There's a language barrier, there are cultural differences, there are concerns about immigration status or documentation status. And so for a number of reasons, traditional messaging from, say, the county health department might not be the most effective way to reach these communities. But instead, what we can do is train community health workers who are members of that community, who may or may not have formal medical training necessarily, but we can teach them what it is that those key topics need to be taken into the community. So through this program, we had trainings every week where we would meet with about 30 different community health workers from our different community-based organizations. We would teach them about COVID-19, how to prevent it, what the testing policies were locally, where to get tested, that it was free, those kinds of ideas, what to expect with contact tracing, that people shouldn't be afraid, that it's not like a police interrogation when someone's asking where you've been or who you've been spending time with, and it's not something that's going to come with criminal offenses, but it's something that is trying to keep people safe, and how to treat COVID-19 and what to expect. There's also, for a number of the reasons I mentioned earlier, a lot of concerns about vaccines. So as those began to emerge, there was a lot of work that went into educating the community about why it was safe and making sure that those communities were represented in the trials that were ongoing. We also talked a lot about state and local policies. Policies have been changing constantly since the outbreak of the pandemic, and there's a lot of confusing and constantly changing terminology. So we wanted to make sure that people understood what they were allowed to do, how they could operate their businesses or places of worship, what different color codes maybe meant or tiers, and how those were changing. We also treated our community health workers as we invested in them personally and professionally. So we tried to educate them about how they could grow. So we did trainings on ideas like time management, and really saw a lot of growth in our community health workers as they were able to rally around this outreach initiative. And they took a lot of pride in the support that they were able to provide to their communities. One other idea that we had that was successful was finding and creating a collection of resources that were specific to refugee communities that were appropriate in terms of health literacy, both in language and kind of the cultural influences that went into some of the messaging. And so we were able to take different tools from around the country, put them all in a shared Google Doc, and that was much easier for our community health workers to navigate than trying to themselves go to the state or the CDC or the WHO to find resources.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was great. Hi, everyone. My name is Assefa, and I am a PhD candidate in Ethnic Studies and Critical Gender Studies here at UCST. And I'm thrilled to be here and to share a bit about the oral histories I conducted with the San Diego Refugee Communities Coalition in the spring of 2021. To start out, I just want to say that as a scholar of ethnic studies, critical refugee studies, and also Black diaspora studies, my work is largely interested in the knowledge production that emerges from refugee communities. So my approach to this particular project, has largely been guided by one, a desire to give primacy to the interests of the coalition. And so in practice, that meant that all of the questions that shaped this oral history were developed in collaboration with members of the coalition. And secondly, this project is also guided by a desire to really identify the material and epistemological stakes that manifest through the work that the SDRCC is doing, which has really been transformative for the community organizing landscape here in the region. The SDRCC is doing something really unique. They've developed a multiracial, multicultural, refugee, and Black-led coalition that has been at the forefront of addressing the needs of refugee families during COVID-19. So, by centering collaboration, culturally competent care, and empowerment, the SDRCC has really done something powerful here. And rather than reinscribing refugees as helpless figures in need of aid, services, or rescue, they really center the leadership of refugees and recognize that refugees themselves have a unique capacity and ability to serve their communities. So in this presentation, I'm going to highlight 3 key elements that define the SDRCC model. And I'm drawing from the oral histories I conducted with member leaders of the coalition. And I'll also share some definitions of community health that emerged through my conversations with the members of the coalition to talk about, what is unique about the coalition and why the SDRCC and the work that they are doing is an important site of knowledge production that really produces a vision for a future in which all people, are treated with care and dignity. So the 3 key elements that define the SDRCC model and inform its capacity to directly meet the needs of refugee families in San Diego County are 1, shared understanding, 2, a desire to take collective action, and 3, a collaborative participatory decision-making model. As Andrew said earlier, the SDRCC is comprised of 11 ethnic-based community organizations. And as refugees themselves, or children of refugees, or also immigrants, everyone sort of holds different immigration or migrant status in the coalition. But all the members of the coalition intimately know the unique set of challenges that forcibly displaced communities experience. Members of the coalition recognize and understand the generational impact of forced displacement as an ongoing process rather than a singular event or something that can be limited to someone's legal status. Further, they also recognize how the refugee experience is shaped by different historical and social processes, such as Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. So this intimate understanding the members of the coalition share produces a sense of mutuality that guides the programs and services that they provide as a collective. And as Andrew said, there are a lot of community health programs, and over the course of the last year and a half, the SDRCC has provided rental assistance, translation services, community health education, crisis intervention, vaccination drives, and also mutual aid, like straight up rental assistance to help folks in the community. And this is something that's also really important about the work of the SDRCC. This shared understanding that they have really expands the breadth of their work. Rather than approaching their work as a single issue struggle, there's a broad array of work that's led by the individual organizations. So for example, one member organization of the SDRCC is Licensed to Freedom, which is the only refugee-led organization that addresses domestic violence in San Diego County. So they really provide wraparound services for those who are experiencing domestic violence that can range from legal support to wellness and counseling support and financial assistance. Another organization is the Partnership of the Advancement of New Americans, known as PANA. They are youth-led advocacy organizations that are leading campaigns around redistricting, refugee resettlement, and policing in San Diego County. Lastly, another organization that I'll highlight just to give you an understanding of how this is a multi-issue sort of organization. Another member org is the Haitian Bridge Alliance. which is, they're really at the forefront nationally of advocacy for Black refugees and asylum seekers. Currently, Haitian Bridge Alliance is leading, like I said, national campaigns to extend TPS for Haitian refugees. They're leading advocacy campaigns to end Title 42, while also working to meet the needs of Black refugees and asylum seekers both in Tijuana and San Diego. So the second key point about the FEC model that I'd like to emphasize is their desire to take collective action. So while each organization organizes individual programs and initiatives, they recognize the power in joining forces to collectively meet the material needs of the broader refugee community in San Diego County. The coalition really values the leadership and expertise of each member organization, and this appreciation for autonomy is reflected in their understanding of, the implications of what it means to be a refugee-led organization in a nonprofit landscape that is proliferated by well-meaning but often not community-based or refugee-led organizations. Right. So the coalition exists as a site of autonomy and leadership for refugees who are committed to serving their communities, making an impact, and also developing their leadership. The members of the SDRCC recognize that the problems faced by their community are not individual failings, but a result of larger social and political issues. So they create space where refugees are empowered to collectively organize and again, provide basic needs for their communities, as well as advocacy. And lastly, the other sort of defining aspect of the SDRCC model is their collaborative participatory decision-making process. So this stems from a shared understanding and a shared set of values that are rooted in a desire, right, for their communities to be given, the interests of their communities to be given primacy. So the coalition has really succeeded at, developing a humble workspace environment where people are reliable, consistent, and present. And one key aspect to their collaborative and participatory model is their commitment to mentorship. So the goal for the coalition is not for everyone to be an expert at all things, but for the skills of different orgs to complement one another and build towards shared growth and development. This is an intergenerational coalition. There are some orgs that have been around, organizing in San Diego since the early 90s, while others have been established, in the last year or two, as a result of, more recently, as a result of the arrival of Afghani refugees in San Diego. There are some Afghan-led EDCOs that have recently joined the SDRCC. So, there's a broad range of organizations within the coalition. And therefore, the coalition has become a site of exchange where people are, providing skills, information, advice, and support to one another based off of their experiences living and working in San Diego, and also out of a desire to see a new generation of leaders emerge who can continue to lead and grow this work in the future. And lastly, it's a consensus-driven decision-making model. Member orgs can step back when they need to, when they feel that a program, grant, or initiative would be repetitive for them, or they simply don't have capacity, but there are regular meetings where proposals emerge, are discussed, modified, and finalized. So, the SDRCC, another key aspect of their work is that they are really reimagining community health, right? So they shift away from narratives about health disparities or health inequities that oftentimes center solutions for these issues in the hands of healthcare providers or institutions, but instead, the SDRCC is displaying that impacted communities can be the drivers for solutions and transformations regarding the most pressing needs And so the SDRCC model is a really valuable site of knowledge production where these like alternative definitions of community health emerge and really drive the scope of their work. And it's a site where racialized ideas of refugees are really being contested, and a framework for a way of coexistence that is defined by collaboration and cares really being put forth. So to close out, I'd like to just share some quotes from some of the oral histories I conducted. The prompt or the question that prompted these responses was largely, it was either what does community health mean to you in your community, or what does a healthy community look like to you? So I'll just read the bolded part of this quote. Someone says, I want to go home and I don't want to be attacked for being a Muslim and walking on the city of Main Street. I want to be accepted. Health means the small city, the mayor, the school, the businesses, all together has to work in a good system. And I have to be a part of that system in order to balance these things. In another interview, someone said, health means government, it means president, political, it means a newspaper, it means street driving, it means enough services, it means me being able to connect and to make good decisions. But how can I make a good decision if everything around me is not good, is not healthy? Here, we had someone say, health is not just about when you're sick and you get a place to get help, but it's also every single moment of your life you have support, like emotional support and someone you can rely on. So community health can be about your family, about your friends, it could be about ECBOs. I consider everybody as a community health worker. And another part of this quote that really resonated with me is, they're saying, community health is, if you have a tie to your own culture or heritage, and then if you can embrace your own culture in this new country, then you feel proud of your own culture. That is a very important part of your health. And lastly, here, someone says, community health looks like material security, and beyond that, it's also the agency to make choices in life and the agency to fulfill your full potential. So I'll just close with those definitions of community health and what health looks like that came directly from refugee families here in San Diego County. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Let's turn it over for questions. Yes.
I thought that was a great talk, and I really appreciated the focus on agency and empowerment and community-driven initiatives. And so I'm very interested in what's going on in the state of California around the formal system recognizing the power of community health workers. So could the two of you talk a little bit about what that looks like at this time under your state health insurance plan? What services are reimbursable when done by community health workers, and what are opportunities beyond, anti-vaccine attitudes or hesitancy for other things like behavioral health and prevention services?
Andrew, do you have a response to that question?
I would need to do some work to get you a good answer on that question. I'd be happy to look into it. I know that certainly is the vision. The dream is to continue expanding community health worker work to encompass more than just direct pandemic response. And that's a lot of the shift that our coalition's been trying to make in the last 6 months or so, is not just to be kind of frontline healthcare workers, but to also be advocating for policy changes and those sorts of things. And that would certainly require being reimbursed and those kinds of ideas for something other than just a vaccine drive. So, but in terms of what specifically is being reimbursed right now or the state policy, I'll have to get back to you on that. But thank you for asking.
Are there other questions?
I have a question. So thank you. I was thinking back to the discussion about the bond fund and just how contentious the discussions were within that group of organizers. trying to decide, who should be prioritized. And then thinking of that in contrast to the way that you were describing sort of the really good, solidarity and collaboration between quite disparate groups. I'm just curious, was it really that smooth? And what's the basis for coalition between such different groups? And weren't there different interests? Weren't there really different things that those groups wanted to prioritize? And how did they really find a way? What was the access that drew them together for collaboration instead of each group organizing indigenously within themselves, for their own organizations and work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that, in any coalition, there are challenges. Collaborative work is never smooth, but to answer your question about why work in collaboration versus working in silos, that was a question that, I really asked a lot of folks, like, what is your investment in being in a coalition? And the reality is, multiple folks cited, one, like the challenges in funding. A lot of these ethnic-based community organizations have never received any type of grant or financial support to be able to keep their doors open. A lot of folks were working and paying out of their own pocket for a space, a place for their communities to meet, and working with very limited budgets to provide services and programs for their communities. And so a lot of folks recognize the strength in numbers simply when it comes to trying to secure grant funds, right? That there was a larger opportunity for them to receive funding and expand their programs and maintain a physical site where the community members could come and be together if they worked in coalition with other refugee communities in the region. And a lot of them actually knew each other by participating in programs that were led by, more larger, well-financed refugee-serving organizations in San Diego, but felt that oftentimes their interests were put to the side, that the programs that they participated in required that they fulfill the demands of a grant rather than actually being rooted in the desires and needs of their local communities. So this was also really a struggle for agency. And members of the coalition recognized that being together and working together in coalition would allow them to challenge, the nonprofit landscape of the region that oftentimes put their interests and their agency secondary to the demands of funders and other political players. So that was really the driving factor for why folks decided to work in collaboration and continue to do so. Andrew, is there anything else you'd add to that?
No, that's perfect. I agree. Yeah.
I have a question about the racialization of refugee communities. When we think about that process, it's usually in terms of the racialization of refugees in public opinion or the racialization of refugees by government policy. But what about in a collaborative context among communities? Is there an absence of racialization, or is there an underlying dynamic of racializing one another?
That's a really good question. And that's one that, I continue to think carefully about and unpack, because the reality is that there is a US racial structure, right, that exists, a US racial formation that doesn't translate to the experiences of forcibly displaced communities who are coming from completely different, religious, racial, cultural contexts. So that's a really, I think, critical question for us to think about when we work with forcibly displaced communities. It's not just how are refugees fitting into US racial structures, but what are the racial formations from their homelands that they also bring with them. In the context of the San Diego Refugees Communities Coalition, I found that the experience of displacement was the primary social status that united folks. But there was an acknowledgement of the different impacts of race, the impact of different types of oppression that members of the coalition experience. For example, in one of the quotes, one of the members is citing Islamophobia, right, as a racializing experience, an othering experience that is unique to the Muslim members of the coalition. Whereas in one of my interviews with Gwendolyn Joseph from Haitian Bridge Alliance, she was speaking specifically to like the anti-Black nature of some immigration policies, such as Title 42, but also the anti-Blackness that emerges in the immigration justice movement, both locally and nationally in the United States, where there's like a large focus of immigration advocacy for Mexican or Central American refugees and asylum seekers, while Black refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers are oftentimes left out or not considered. So there are multiple ways in which the racialization of refugees is emerging through the coalition. And the way that it's addressed is that members of the coalition, support one another's ongoing campaigns, whether that's an advocacy campaign or a program. But I think that for future directions of my own work, and I think future directions of the coalition as well, there are definitely questions to unpack about both the like intra-community impacts of race and difference and culture, as in addition to like the broader systemic issues that they face in the United States as refugees.